This unknown patient has been in the hospital for 5 years already, but there was still no improvement in her condition. All that time, the young woman was in a state of traumatic coma. The medical staff taking care of her were most interested in finding out her first and last name. Among themselves, the staff started calling her Nancy. The health workers weren't sure why that was the name that they came up with. Time passed, and nobody visited or asked about the unconscious patient. Upon her admission into the hospital, Nancy did not have any ID. The young woman was found on the border of 2 states, Iowa and Nebraska. As a result, there were a lot of jurisdiction issues with her case. Nancy was found next to the railroad tracks, which suggested that she was a passenger on one of the passing trains. Unfortunately, despite all efforts, it turned out to be impossible to shed light on the young woman's identity. Only one person caring about the patient was truly concerned about her fate. Natalie Mitchell worked as a nurse for about 5 years. It so happened that her first day of work was the day that Nancy was admitted. On her first day, a young woman was brought into the intensive care unit. She had a serious head injury, which likely caused the coma. Natalie came into Nancy's room every day. Involuntarily, she became attached to the young patient and even began to consider her kind of a friend. Whenever the nurse had a free moment, she would always come to visit her favorite patient and speak to her, even though Nancy couldn't answer. Natalie read books and newspapers to Nancy, summarized the latest news, and even recited poetry. Of course, Natalie's colleagues regarded her actions with a fair amount of skepticism. They didn't believe that her technique could bring any results. But Natalie continued to believe no matter what. She believed that Nancy would one day come out of her borderline state. But time passed, and there was no improvement in Nancy's well-being. On top of that, the leaders of the hospital faced a problem that they needed a lot of resources to solve. The department in charge of keeping Nancy alive needed additional financing. At one point, the head doctor faced a dilemma: whether to disconnect Nancy from life support or to extend her life for some more time. When Natalie found out about this, she was the first to volunteer to help the unfortunate young woman. To accomplish this, she was willing to transfer her salary into the hospital's account. Frankly, many of the hospital's employees thought that Natalie was going crazy. Why do you care so much about this woman? It is quite possible that she will not ever even wake up after 20 years, the most experienced nurses said while shaking their heads in disapproval. But Natalie felt strongly that she could not leave Nancy in trouble. Of course, Natalie was well aware of the fact that she did not actually know the young woman and that her name might not actually be Nancy. This knowledge, however, did not diminish the attachment she felt towards her. As expected, Natalie's problem didn't end there. Her relatively small salary was not enough to provide Nancy with everything she needed. Volunteer organizations were able to contribute to Nancy's care, but in general, the problem was only partially solved. Trying to find a way out of the difficult situation, Natalie decided to turn to the media and social networks. After taking a photograph of Nancy, Natalie posted it on different platforms. At first, no one believed in Natalie's venture, but when a week later, a young woman of about 30 came to the hospital and said that she wanted to see Nancy, Natalie's colleagues took back their words. As it turned out, the patient laying in a coma was not Nancy. Her real name was Catherine Sommers. At the time of the injury, she was 25 years old. The visitor was named Rebecca Parker. She stated with absolute certainty that she knew the patient. "Are you her sister?" Natalie asked cautiously. "No, it would be more accurate to say that I'm her acquaintance," Rebecca answered as she blushed deeply. At that moment, Natalie realized that the visitor was hiding something. It was evident by the way her hands trembled and her eyes darted from side to side, unable to focus on one thing. Sitting across from Catherine, Rebecca covered her face with her hands and wept softly. At that moment, Natalie felt awkward that she became an unwitting witness to such a private scene. If it were up to her, she would give up everything so that Nancy, aka Catherine, could finally wake up. However, at that moment, Natalie was most interested in hearing Catherine's story. How did she end up next to the railroad tracks, and where were her relatives? Having asked Rebecca, the young nurse did not expect to get an honest answer. But when the visitor sighed sadly and began to tell her story, Natalie changed her mind about Rebecca. It turned out that Catherine Somers was an orphan. Her mother died 10 years prior, and she never knew her dad. At the turning point in her life, Catherine met a man named Spencer Donahue, who charmed her with his courtship and expensive gifts. Of course, Catherine had no idea that Spencer was a great specialist in deceiving women and was a skilled swindler. Few people knew that Spencer would pretend to live with several women at once and lead them all on quite successfully. He would ask one woman to help him finance a business project and another one to fund his father's medical treatment, even though he never even had a father. It is unknown how long ago Spencer began deceiving women, but Catherine Somers was the first to figure out his machinations. What's most interesting is that for some inexplicable reason, it is Catherine that Spencer decided to wed legally. Most likely, when his schemes were uncovered, he decided to get rid of the witness in the most inhumane way possible. That's when Catherine was discovered at the side of the railroad tracks. "How do you even know all this?" Natalie asked the logical question. "I know this because I was one of Spencer's victims. I fell under his spell," Rebecca admitted courageously. The unexpected truth shocked Natalie. She did not expect to hear something like that. At first, she thought that everything that she had just heard was some kind of elaborate joke. But when she saw Rebecca's eyes, she realized that it was all the purest truth. You see, at the time, I did not know that Spencer had a wife. And of course, I knew nothing about his dishonest lifestyle. On top of it, shortly before my separation from Spencer, I tried to warn Catherine about how dangerous he was, but she didn't listen to me. She likely already knew about my relationship with Spencer and couldn't forgive me. Afterwards, I broke off all relations with the scoundrel and never saw him again. Years later, I recognized Spencer's wife in the photo I see online, Rebecca answered. Natalie started to cry as she understood the absurdity of the situation in which this unfortunate young woman found herself. "I think we need to go to the police," the nurse said timidly. Yes, of course, you're right," Rebecca muttered and carefully touched Catherine's hand. Now that the mystery of the unknown patient was solved, the hospital's management immediately reported what they knew to the police. When Spencer was detained and taken into custody, he confessed almost immediately. At that time, the swindler was in a relationship with several women who he had been successfully deceiving for a long time. When asked what he did to Catherine, the scoundrel replied, "I thought that I'd be able to keep everything a secret, but my wife turned out to be too smart. It was then that I began to regret the decision to marry her, so under the guise of a fun trip, I suggested that we take the train. When the train was moving at full speed, I chose a convenient moment to lead her into the vestibule, where I pushed her off the train. I thought the body would be mutilated beyond recognition and would never be found." The swindler's story even shocked the seasoned policeman. In this way, thanks to one of Spencer's many victims, the mystery of the unknown patient in a coma was solved. Of course, had Rebecca Parker remained silent, he would have been able to act with impunity for several more months or even years. After this incident, Natalie looked at Rebecca in a completely different way. She understood that Rebecca was a victim and that none of what had happened to Catherine was her fault. Just like dozens of other deceived women, Rebecca fell into a vile swindler's trap who held nothing sacred. At the time of her breakup with Spencer, Rebecca had no idea that he was planning to kill his wife. It is difficult to say what makes someone want to take another person's life. Most likely, Spencer was driven by an instinct to cover his tracks like a wild animal. A month passed since Spencer's arrest, during which Rebecca visited Catherine almost every day. To those who didn't know the full story, it seemed that the two women were sisters, sharing meaningful moments in the midst of a very difficult situation. Looking at Catherine's lifeless body, Rebecca prayed that she would wake up as soon as possible. But time went on, and Catherine's condition remained the same. At some point, the hospital's management once again brought up the issue of disconnecting her from life support. But that time, it wasn't just Natalie, but also Rebecca who advocated for her. Rebecca promised to pay all the costs associated with Catherine's care. Just 1 week after that conversation, Catherine woke up. Just imagine how overjoyed Natalie was when she witnessed what she believed to be a true miracle. Frankly, no one believed that Catherine would ever wake up. By that point, Spencer was behind bars in a state county jail and could not harm her anymore. When Catherine opened her eyes, the first person she saw next to her was Rebecca. How did you get here? And what happened to me? Muttered Catherine. Rebecca was embarrassed and fidgeted with her hands as she tried to explain everything that had happened. Trying to explain everything in an intelligible manner, Rebecca showed Catherine a photo of Spencer with yet another beautiful woman who became his victim. Why are you showing me this? After all, you chose to become his lover even though he was married, whispered Catherine. Fortunately, Natalie arrived at that moment. She joined the conversation and explained that if it weren't for Rebecca, Catherine might not have come out of the coma at all. Catherine fully understood the situation a little later, when she calmed down and got used to her new reality. According to Catherine, all the while she was in the coma, she had wonderful dreams in which a pleasant female voice read books and told stories. That was me, Natalie said modestly, lowering her eyes. Having learned about Rebecca's role in the story, Catherine understood that she was not to blame, and the two women became friends. In fact, they were both victims of a swindler who took advantage of them and who only cared about becoming rich at the expense of others. Subsequently, Catherine, Natalie, and Rebecca all became good friends who often met up to spend time together. While Catherine and Natalie are not currently interested in dating, Natalie has been dating a wonderful man for quite a while. He intends to propose. Having heard the stories of her two friends, the young nurse knows that she needs to keep a clear head and a sober mind in every situation. That would diminish the chances of her becoming deceived in the same manner as Catherine and Rebecca were.